All right, so our final learning objective for this unit is just called solving quadratics, which is something we've already done. All right, because we've learned a lot of different ways to solve quadratics. We have factoring, square roots, completing the square, the quadratic formula. So we have all these different ways. All right, some can be used all the time, like the quadratic formula. Some can only be used in certain circumstances, like factoring and using the square root. But it's helpful to have all of these in your toolbox because some are going to be more useful than others. For instance, the quadratic formula can solve every quadratic, but sometimes you're giving yourself like 10 extra steps by trying to do the quadratic formula every single time. So by having other methods to solve quadratics, it's going to kind of make your solving more effective. It also kind of shows that you have a better understanding of everything that's going on in the problems. All right, so although we have this really powerful tool, the quadratic formula, it's still important to remember the other things that we learned earlier in the unit. All right, so here we have the example x squared plus 8 equals 7x. The only time we don't get 0 on one side of the equation is we're doing the square root property, and we're not going to be able to do the square root property here because we have an x squared and a normal x. So what I'm going to do first is subtract this 7x from both sides. X squared minus 7x plus 8 equals 0. And now I have some options. I could do completing the square. I can't do the square root property, but I could factor. I could do the quadratic formula. So generally whenever I see that there's no number in front of the x squared, I'll check really quickly to see if I can factor it, because when there's just a 1 in front of the x squared, I can do the shortcut method of factoring, which is b is -7, ac is 8. All right, so is this possible? Yeah, I can do it with -8 and 1. So this one I can do the shortcut method of factoring. I'm just writing this as x minus 8 times x plus 1 equals 0. And then once we break it into its two factors, we separate it into two different equations, each of those factors equal to 0. And we get 8 and -1. So you can see it didn't take me very many steps because I have this whole toolkit of ways to solve quadratics. I recognize that I can factor this one, and not only can I factor it, but I can factor it using the quick method because there's just a 1 in front of x squared, and that allows me to get to these answers pretty quickly. Again, this one, I could do the quadratic formula. That would require you to FOIL, combine like terms, simplify, and all that stuff. All right, so also remember there's other methods to solve quadratics. It's not all the quadratic formula. So in this case, I would add 16 to both sides and divide both sides by 2. And how did I know I want to do that? I see this big thing that has a squared on it, and I know when I have something like that, I can use the square root property, which now I'm going to use because I have it by itself. I can use the square roots to get rid of that exponent. All right, a couple things to remember is you have to get the squared thing by itself, so I have to get this whole thing by itself first. And the other thing is whenever you take the square, you have to get that plus or minus. All right, but now I just add 7 and then simplify my square root just a little bit to get my final answer. All right, so again, you could get the same answer by doing the quadratic formula by multiplying it all out and stuff, or completing the square, which actually I already did completing the square. All right, so there's other methods to do, but this is the only way that you can, or kind of the quickest method of seeing that you can use the square root property and do it that way. So again, this is why it's important to talk about all the different ways to solve, because the least number of steps, the less likely you are to make a mistake, which is always good. And it kind of takes you less brain power to kind of go through all the steps. So if you can kind of take a second at the beginning, figure out which method is going to be the best, and then only do that method to save yourself some time. All right, this quadratic equation looks set up pretty nicely. It just looks like I'm going to get like 3 and -2 as my answers. All right, but there's one problem, is that factoring method only works when you have 0 on one side. So unfortunately, I can't just break this down into x minus 3 equals 0 and x plus 2 equals 0. It only works when 0 is on the other side of the equation. So this one's going to be a little bit longer. What I'm going to do is FOIL this all out. So that now I can move this 2 over. And now I have 0 on one side. So now I can kind of go through and say, okay, are there other ways I can solve this? All right, could I factor it? Well, my b is -1 and my ac is -4. Is there any way to multiply the -4 and add a give 1? Well, 4 and 1 is not going to work, and 2 and 2 is not going to work. So this one actually doesn't factor. but it's kind of helpful to just take that little bit of time and see if it is possible, because that's kind of the shortest method. Doesn't factor, so now I could do completing the square. If I did completing the square, I'd have to take a -1 and divide it by 2, which gives me a fraction, so that's not fun. So now I realize, well, maybe I'll just do the quadratic formula. All right, there's nothing really else that's going to work and be super nice, so really quadratic formula is my only option now. So I'm plugging everything in. I'm going to simplify that square root. And I'm actually done because that square root does not simplify at all. All right, so I'm just done there. And that's my final answer. All right, one thing that did not happen in this video is I haven't got any negative square roots, but if this was, let's just say, in some imaginary scenario, this was 1 plus or minus the square root of -17/2, then my final answer, I'd have to pull out that I, because now we have complex numbers that allow us to answer these questions and actually say there's a solution to our quadratic. All right, here's one for you to try on your own. I'd solve this quadratic, all right, whichever method you think is best. And with all these problems, it's not going to be one specific way to do it. When I did it, again, get 0 on one side because that's the way we kind of start off a lot of solving quadratic problems. I quickly checked to see if it would be possible to factor, and it was without too much effort. All right, so I factored it and then split it up into those two answers. All right, maybe you didn't want to take the time to factor it, or you couldn't quickly figure out what numbers are going to work to factor. So then you go, okay, well, using the square root is not going to work. I don't want to completely the square, so then like quadratic formula. So I've used the quadratic formula that's over here on the left. Eventually you get the square root to go away, so you can actually break it up into two nice answers that you get down there. So of course you get the same answers no matter which way you do it, as long as you do it correctly. All right, so it's not all about doing it specifically the best way or a right way or anything like that. Every way you can do is fine. I just know that some are going to be less steps than others. All right, so it's really all up to you what you're most comfortable with. All right, I'm pretty good at factoring, and I think it's the least number of steps for me, so I'll always try to factor first. But for you, you might say, oh, quadratic formula works for everything, so I'll try to use that as much as possible, and that's perfectly acceptable as well. But just knowing kind of all these different tools you have and using them is going to be really helpful for you. All right, but this is the video. The whole unit was really all about solving quadratics, so now we have kind of our four main methods. We can factor, we can use square roots, we can do completing the square, we can do the quadratic formula. And at the beginning of the unit, we would have to say sometimes there's no solution, but now we'll never have no solution because now we have complex numbers as well. So every single quadratic I give you, there will be some type of solution. Some just might have this imaginary I in it as well. If you go ahead and practice this, it's basically going to be almost like a review of the whole unit. All these different things you can do, factoring, square roots, quadratic formula, all that stuff is going to come back up and just kind of get good at solving quadratics.